Welcome back to Steen Family Outdoors. Today we have a fun topic. We're going to be doing some rifle cartridge comparisons. And before we get into it, please take a moment if you haven't and hit subscribe on the channel. If you like the video that we shared today, please hit that like button as well. So when we talk about comparing cartridges, we're really going to hone in today on a specific hunting build that I'm going to be working on. So when I'm looking at this build, we're going to be looking at short action cartridges. So as I lay out the cartridges that we're going to take a look at, we're going to look at cartridges that are 2.825 inches in cartridge overall length or less. A lot of them will be at about that 2.81 inch mark for the SAMI overall length spec. We're going to be looking at cartridges that are based off of the 0.473 inch rim diameter, or in that ballpark for rim diameter. So that's going to exclude the short magnums in this case. And the reason we're excluding those is because we're also putting a weight limit on this build. We're going to have a all-in rifle build that we're going to go for that gets us to about the 6 pound mark. And this is going to be a hunting rifle. So we want to be able to effectively take game out to at least 400 yards. Hopefully we're always trying to get closer, but we want to have that ability to stretch to at least 400 yards in this case. And that's the framework we're going to be looking at rifle cartridges today at. So those are the criteria that we have up on screen that we're going to be looking at. Let's take a look at the cartridges that we're going to dive into. We're going to look at the 243 Winchester, 6mm Creedmoor. We're going to look at the 257 Roberts and the Roberts Ackley Improved, 260 Remington, 6.5 Creedmoor, 7mm Odd 8, 308, 338 Federal, and 358 Win. So we're going to go through the whole spectrum of cartridges and take a look at those. So we're really dialed in on a lot of those have a 308 parent case. The Creedmoor line, and then the 257 Roberts has some lineage back to the 7x57 Mauser. I know there's other cartridges that are going to fall in this category, and if your cartridge was excluded from that list, I apologize. I wanted to get a good span of cartridges that we could take a look at without having to go through 15 to 20 different cartridges that start to stack up on each other pretty tightly, especially when we look at performance. We're also going to spend just a little bit of time. As a hand loader, I don't always think the most about factory available ammunition, but I'm going to make it at least a little bit of a point to talk through factory availability on some of these as well. So let's dive into it. I'm going to pull up a first chart here on the screen. I've got my laptop up. We've ran some numbers on it that I want to share with you as we make some of these decisions on the cartridge. So we started with kind of a baseline, and we are looking at these cartridges. They're ballistic info, and we use the Nosler Partition. The reason we use the Nosler Partition in this case is because it's widely manufactured across the calibers, and it also has the availability of sectional densities that are relatively close to each other. And I've talked about this before in some of my videos. I like to use sectional density as a proxy to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples with cartridges, right? I want to make sure that if I talk to you about a rifle cartridge, I'm not overly handicapping one versus the other because I'm looking at a really heavy bullet weight for one and then a really light bullet weight respective to their caliber in another. And then I can tell you that, oh, one has a great muzzle velocity or the other holds energy downrange much better. It starts to be an area where you can manipulate the numbers to tell a story or to get a reaction. And I really want to make sure we're looking at this as objectively as possible. So I'm starting with this as a baseline. We'll take a look at maybe a bullet later on here with a better ballistic coefficient as we kind of work through this, but this is our baseline to start with. So I look at the cartridge, going left to right, the cartridge, the weight of the bullet's ballistic coefficient, the sectional density, and I'm trying to get sectional densities to about 0.25. And I talk about a hunting rifle. I should put this in at the front end. I'll put it in at text so you'll be hearing it after you see it. We're going to use this, think up to deer-sized animal, white-tailed deer, mule deer-sized animals, sheep, goats, both mountain and antelope style game as well. So that's the limit of game we're talking about. I wouldn't necessarily, for my purposes, I would exclude elk out of this picture. Just a personal preference. I'd rather pursue elk with a larger rifle with more powder capacity, more energy, put a bigger bullet downrange than a short action cartridge. I know some of you hunt elk with short actions. No stones thrown at that. That's just a personal decision. So we have cartridge, the weight, ballistic coefficient, sectional density. We chose the .25 because it matches the game that we're pursuing. A maximum point blank range, and I'm calling that plus or minus 3 inches. So at what yardage can I hold and still hit plus or minus, not hold, but how far can I shoot and be within that plus or minus 3 inch window? So if you're a maximum point blank range hunter, I want to make sure I include that for you. I want to look at wind drift out at 400 yards. The truth of the matter is, as you get to 300 and 200 yards at a 10 mile per hour crosswind, it just doesn't, there's not enough difference to show. So I'm stretching it out to the max hunting range that I set up in the beginning of 400 yards, just so we can see the differences that exist when it comes to wind drift. 1,800 feet per second yardage. So what we're doing here is looking at the yardage, and this is from a lot of hunting bullets. Your more standard hunting bullets talk about 1,800 feet per second is kind of the minimum expansion velocity that they have. So that's the minimum velocity when the bullet impacts the game that you would expect it to perform well. And then I'm using 1,000 foot-pounds of kinetic energy mark. Some people are big kinetic energy advocates for looking at how that number impacts terminal performance on game. I say my mileage probably varies a little bit, or opinion, but I want to make sure we just have a good collective view of the data that we have available. So when we look through a lot of these cartridges, some things that stick out to me. First off, if you're talking about a 400-yard hunting rifle, you're probably happy with almost every cartridge on this list to some extent. As you get to the really big bullet diameters, so your 338s and 358s, inside of that short action case, they start to have some capacity issues, but you're knocking right on that door. So I could end the video right here and just say, choose one of them, get accurate with it, and go about your day, but that's not a lot of fun. So we're gonna take some time and split into these a little bit. One I'll call out quickly, I think the 257 Roberts, and showing the 257 Roberts Ackley improved, there is quite the discrepancy in velocity. Like, you gain some really significant velocity by going to the Ackley improved chambering. So if you're a 257 Roberts person, the Ackley improved does have some benefits. All of this data, by the way, of muzzle velocity is coming from Nosler's own website load data. So I'm grabbing the Nosler Partition, the weight grain listed, and I'm grabbing the max hand load velocity that they put on the load data. When we look at our 6mm, you're a toss-up, right? If you're doing a 6mm Creedmoor 243 in this case, they're essentially giving you the same performance, really, really close. Same can be said for your 260 Remington and 6.5 Creedmoor. Quite a bit of overlap there as well. You could go either way with those cartridges with this bullet based on this load data, right? And you'd be relatively happy with the overall performance. Let's take a second too. I'll throw a trajectory one out here, because I know this is, when I look at cartridges, I like to look at the trajectory probably a little bit more than point blank range, because I like to zero my rifles at 100 yards and then dial from that point to the yardage where I want to be at. I just think it gives me a more consistent home point for every rifle I shoot, 0 out of 100, dial from there. And I don't have to guess what's my point blank range on any rifle I take from the safe. If you're a 1 rifle shooter or a 2 rifle shooter, I think the point blank range is very repeatable. It's a good way to set up. I just like the ability to dial in when I want to. So we look at these again at 200 yards. We're at 100 yard 0. Everything but our really big bores are stacking up pretty close. Again, this 257 Roberts, the non-Ackley improved chambers, a pretty big laggard out of that group. 300 yards still, we're within a couple inches. 400 yards, we're really not differentiating a whole lot. You're starting to see the 308s trailing off a bit faster. 500, and you really have to get out to 600 yards to see a significant change in trajectory, especially aside from your 243s and 6mm that are hands down your fastest cartridges in this group that are maintaining their trajectory well out. You got to hand it to your 6.5s though, because they do a great job of also holding trajectory. But again, there's still just not a significant amount of change between these cartridges. But overall in hunting, one thing that I think is important to understand is that these gaps, the difference between 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, 5 to 6, gets bigger and bigger and bigger as you go out, regardless of cartridge. So that need to get really honed in on your rangefinder, especially when you're going from 400 to 500 yards. You know, if an animal's mulling around, you can start to lose 20 to 30 yards pretty quick either way in where that animal sits. So getting good consistent ranges on a still animal becomes so important once we're stretching out past 400. And I start to prioritize velocity quite a bit because of that. I just like to eliminate some of that margin for error that can happen in a dynamic hunting situation. Let's throw up a quick graph. This is the graphical side of what these cartridges look like. So again, your 308, your 7mm aught 8, your 6.5s, your 257s, and 6mm are all stacked up really tightly here. And then you see the big drop off with your 338 and 358. Some cartridges that I think are really underrated are still that 338 Federal and 358 Winchester. They have some cool applications. They can make really great hunting rifles. And when we still back it up to that, if you even look at this as a graphical side, out to say 300 yards, there's still just not that big of a difference in drop off. So if you're at sub 300 yards and you like having that big frontal area, so frontal area, you're talking just, you want to put a big hole in the animal, I can't knock anyone who thinks a 338 Federal or a 358 Winchester would just be a fantastic hunting rifle, because you're going to put the hurt on animals, especially in those close ranges. But ultimately, we'll go back to probably the chart that I like to use, this side where we're talking about the ballistic coefficients, sectional densities, point blank range, wind speed, velocity. We'll come back here, but we do have to make some cuts, right? If we're going to choose one cartridge to be our go-to short action hunting cartridge, ultimately we do have to start cutting some out, because the goal of this video is to pick one, and then for everyone who's watched to this point gets to the comments to tell me where I screwed up at or which one they'd prefer to take. All right, so to start off with, it's probably not a big surprise. We're going to skim out that 338 Federal and 358 Win. One thing, if you look at these quick, you'll see the sectional density on the 338 Federal is the highest of all the cartridges that we've looked at. So if you could get this down, if you could find a solid 200 grain 338 bullet or even 180 grain, you might start seeing a little better performance. When I looked at those, I couldn't get a bullet that lined up consistently across the board, so we might be unfairly punishing the 338 Federal here just a little bit. But the moral of the story, when you get above a 30 caliber in that 308 parent case, is you're pushing so much more weight based on just the bullet size that you have, that you start to impact the velocity pretty significantly. Where when we looked at velocities, and I'll go back to that previous chart, when you go to velocities above the 308, for the 308, 7mm 08, 6.5 Creedmoor on up, they're stacked in pretty tight. There's not a huge difference. So you're seeing the efficiency of that, the ability of that cartridge to push velocity starts to get diminished quite a bit when we get up into those bigger sizes. So the first thing is we're going to move away from that 338 and 358. The next one's in the chopping block for me, and I know this one will ruffle some feathers, I'm taking the 6mm out of the equation. The reason being is that I don't gain enough in velocity for big game hunting to remove that much frontal area in my hunting. So I'm getting a smaller bullet diameter. I'm getting a flatter trajectory, no doubt about it, and I love a flat trajectory. But I don't want to impact my terminal performance, especially when I'm talking 400 and in. So for me, these are the next two that are on my chopping block. These are the ones that pain me the most to take off. I'm going to take off the 257 Roberts and the 257 Roberts Ackley Improved. If I was not including, if you could go to every hunting store and find 257 Roberts Ackley Improved, it would probably be my favorite one on here. And as a hand loader, if I was building a rifle to not share with you and talk to you about as folks watching the video, I would choose the 257 Roberts Ackley Improved. It's just that it's hard to give it a glowing recommendation when the availability is so narrow, and it becomes a hand loader proposition at that point. So I'm bummed to take it off the list, but in fairness to maybe saying which is the best, if I can't include availability to some level, I feel like I'm being pretty disingenuous at that spot. When we get into these four that are left, so these are the four that we're narrowed down to. We've got our 260 Remington, 6.5 Creedmoor, 7mm odd 8, and 308. It's probably not a big surprise that if you go to a lot of manufacturers, what they produce, they're producing rifles in these cartridges, just because, for the reason we're talking about here, they perform really well, they maintain their energy, they're solid 500 plus yard performance with standard hunting bullets. You're going to have that capability. So these are the four that I get down to, and unfortunately, you just saw it, I am going to axe the 260 Remington off this list. You can't find it as much as the 6.5 Creedmoor. It's not even close. The 6.5 Creedmoor is so commercially available at this point. Putting the 260 Remington and the 6.5 Creedmoor on the same list is a little redundant. If you like the 260 Remington, no stones thrown. But there's just 6.5 Creedmoors everywhere, and it actually has better published muzzle velocity. And this is from Nosler, not even from Hornady, so you got to give that some credence as well. So these are the top three that I would narrow down to: your 6.5 Creedmoor, your 7mm odd 8, and your 308 Winchester. You look at them, their velocities stack up really tight. Their wind drift, very similar. They're getting the same type of velocity and energy on target. So any one of these threes with a Nosler Partition in this size, you would be thrilled with. I know the question is going to linger out there, though. Why are we looking at a Nosler Partition and not a bullet with a higher ballistic coefficient? So let's look what happens when we use a higher BC bullet. So on this chart, we're going to show the 6.5 Creedmoor, 7mm odd 8, and 308 Winchester. The top chart is our Nosler Partition rounds. The bottom chart is a Hornady ELDX factory loading. So these are the factory loads, the factory box information provided by Hornady. What sticks out for me? First off, we're gaining weight, right? The weight is going up because we're going to those high BC bullets. So when we go to a high BC bullet, there's a few ways to make your ballistic coefficient goes up. One way is you change the profile of the bullet. So if you see bullets that maybe had a flat bottom, a flat base, we can change that to a boat tail, right? And then we can also add, maybe it's a tip onto the bullet versus a round nose. We can sleek up that shape. That's a way to improve ballistic coefficient while maintaining weight. The other way, we need to increase the weight. The sectional density goes up. Because sectional density is essentially how heavy is that bullet based on the cartridge that you're shooting it from. All right, so if we make it heavier, it has to get longer, and those longer bullets turn sleeker, and inherently you're going to see a higher ballistic coefficient come out as sectional density goes up. So in this case, our 6.5 Creedmoor is going up the most. It actually had the highest starting sectional density, and it's also gaining the most sectional density in this as well. 7mm 08 is grabbing 10 grains, 308 is grabbing 13 grains. Now you could take that 7mm 08 and you could crank it up to 162 grain ELDX. You could take the 308 and you could try to crank it up to a 200 grain or 212 grain. But you're already seeing the effects of what happens when you crank up the weight on these bullets. The 7mm 08, 308, 6.5 Creedmoor, they've all taken a big hit when it comes to their muzzle velocity. And when you're cranking the weight up even more on those, you're going to see that 308 and 7mm odd eighths velocity tank even harder, especially the 308. So there's an effect that the larger we go up in bullet diameter, the more weight we have to stack on to get sectional density growth to happen. So that's how you can get really efficient bullets. You hear about this, and some of it's spun as marketing at times, but some of it's also just facts. You can get more efficient bullets in a 6.5, a 6mm, than you can at a 7mm or a 308, because you don't have to crank the weight up as a pure number of grains as aggressively to get there. And what that ultimately means is the powder that I burn, I can maintain muzzle velocity better because I'm not pushing even more and more weight. Just look at what happened with our 338 Federal, our 358 Winchester. You add more weight, eventually your velocity is just going to get down to a point where you can't get a high enough starting velocity to start. And that's why you'll see 300 PRCs, 7 PRCs as rounds, and you don't see 30mm Creedmoors and 7mm Creedmoors getting produced today because there's just not enough powder to make it go. But you do see, you're seeing Wildcats with the 25 Creedmoor. You've seen the 6mm Creedmoor we talked about today, and the 22 Creedmoors coming on scene because there is an effect in that small case envelope to get sufficient muzzle velocities with these high BC bullets. So a little bit of a detour, but that's what you're seeing on this chart, is that you're getting the 6.5 Creedmoor still is doing pretty dang good in velocity. It's maintaining a comparable point blank range with the 7mm 08 that's pushing 70 feet per second faster, but it's bucking the wind better, and both of those rounds are maintaining their feet per second and energy well out past the 1,800 yards the 600 yards and the 600 yards for the 1,000 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. So that you're seeing that there's no doubt we're getting down-range improvements when we go to the high BC bullets, but we are talking about a 400-yard in bullet. This is where I think sometimes we do let the marketing sway us in the high BC bullet range. Is the top chart here that's showing Nosler Partitions. These are fine hunting bullets, and these are in the sectional density that we'd really look at for the game we talked about. We're talking about mule deer size game and below. These are fine sectional densities, so good weight for the bullets that we're hunting with. We got good muzzle velocities. We're pushing our point blank ranges out further. We are losing a little bit in the wind drift department, but not significantly, especially at the 400-yard mark, which I kind of said at the beginning was our max hunting range. And we're still, if we need to stretch it out to 500-600 yards, we're capable of doing that. I still think that, especially in a 6-pound rifle like we're talking about in this case, that's a very challenging shot to pull off with a lighter rifle setup like we're talking about building here. So keep that in mind when you're looking at a hunting setup. Do I really care that I carry muzzle energy or my bullet energy to 800 yards and the partition can only carry it to 605? You probably don't, because you're not going to hunt that far, so it just doesn't matter. You want to make sure that the bullet's performing its job in the range you want it to, and that you're getting that performance consistently, instead of evaluating your bullet choice or your cartridge choice based on a criteria that you may not ever end up using. I'll prove this point out a little bit further. We look at trajectories in this next chart. So we're looking at 200 yards. Again, things stay pretty stacked up. 300 yards, we're starting to see a bit of a difference. 400, it's more pronounced. Even if you go, the takeaway on this, even at 600 yards, our bullet drop, our trajectory is still better with that lighter bullet than it is with the heavier bullet. We're still flatter out to 600 yards than we would be with the high BC bullet. You can see on the 7mm odd 8, those are getting ready to cross, they're getting ready to merge, and there's going to be a spot where the 7mm odd 8 high BC bullet will take over past 600 yards and will be flatter out past that point. But to 600, there's no marked difference here. So again, we got flatter trajectories with our traditional hunting bullet. It's a Partition. It's not even an AccuBond style or a TTSX Barnes with a nice tipped on it. Just your standard classic hunting bullet. We can get really, really solid trajectories out of those as well. So let's get to the punchline on this. We've looked at several different cartridges. We've evaluated their trajectories, their energies, their point blank ranges. I kind of talked through the ones that fell off the list for me and the ones that stayed on it. For me, this is going to come down to a choice between 2 rounds. The 6.5, the 7mm 08, and the 308, you can't go wrong with any of them. I'm probably taking the 7mm odd 8 out of the picture because it sits kind of square in the middle. If I wanted a little flatter trajectory, I'm just going to go with the 6.5 Creedmoor. If I want to put a bigger hole in the animal and have maybe a little more punch, I'm going to go with the 308. If you're looking at availability, both the 308 and 6.5 Creedmoor have great availability. 7mm 08 is still relatively available, but it's hard to beat 6.5 and 308 when it comes to availability. It's hard to beat that when it comes to loaded ammunitions. They all can be great hand-loaded cartridges. Ironically enough, if I was choosing this, I still go back to the 257 Roberts Ackley Improved. If you're a hand loader, I think that's the coolest thing out there. I like kind of different rounds. I'm going to say I like different rounds. And then I'm going to say I think the 6.5 Creedmoor is probably the best short action hunting round out there. It performs well with your traditional hunting bullets. We showed that it still performs well if you really want to use a high BC bullet, if that's important to you. It still does better than the 308 does in that same capacity. So as much as I really don't want to say the 6.5 Creedmoor because that's been what everyone said for the past decade plus now, I think it's just because it's right. I think the 6.5 Creedmoor is the best go-to round if you're looking at a short action hunting rifle to get. If you're an adult shooter and you can handle a reasonable amount of recoil, 6.5 Creedmoor, 708, 308 are great. If you're a little on the recoil shy side of it, if you're a youth, I could see some of these other ones like a 243 making sense. But in this case, I'm going with the 6.5 Creedmoor. We're going to start building up a rifle based on it as well. So thank you for watching. This is the start of a series of videos though. So I hope that you're excited about it. We're going to go over a rifle build on a 6.5 Creedmoor that's going to be at max weight 6 pounds with a scope on it. We're going to put together, I'll talk through that. I'm also going to do the same thing with long action cartridges, kind of based off a 30-06 family of cartridges. And we're going to be looking to build a rifle at 7 pounds for that. So we got a few rifle builds coming up. We're going to be looking at more cartridges. So if you like this, subscribe to the channel, hit the like video. And until next time, get out there and enjoy the outdoors.